From Bonnie and Clyde through Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, couples who commit crimes together stay together, or at least share a death or prison sentence, mostly. From paying off the drug dealer or gambling debts to just getting a twisted kick, criminal couples are a perfect storm of two bad people getting together to make a horrible mashup. Not just two people in love, crime spree couples have other, more nefarious interests. And if neither are repulsed or infatuated to extremes, it can get deadly real fast. A crime spree is a series of crimes committed in quick succession. The U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics defines a spree killing as killings at two or more locations with almost no time break between murders. Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine May Wood, the lethal lovers. Graham and Wood both worked at a nursing home in 1986. They hooked up and started their murder career a few months later in early 1987. Gwendolyn, according to Catherine, smothered an early Alzheimer's sufferer. The woman would have been frail and incapacitated and not in a position to defend herself. Using a wet washcloth to smother their victim, the murder was believed to be normal causes, and therefore no investigation took place. Rather than being horrified by the human act, Catherine indulged her lover, and they turned future murders into a component of their relationship over the following 8 weeks, each apparently believing the murders would cement their bond and prevent the other from leaving the relationship. 4 more vulnerable women died in that short time, and the deaths went undetected as suspicious. The couple broke up when Gwendolyn started dating another aide at the nursing home, and they eventually moved to work in a hospital caring for children. Catherine struck a plea bargain in exchange for her testimony against her ex-lover, the mastermind and perpetrator in the murders, and claimed her only involvement was that of a lookout for her lover's crimes. Catherine also claimed they turned the murders into a sort of game, and the plan was to make the initials of their victims spell out murder. Gwendolyn, of course, claimed otherwise. She said that it was Catherine that instigated the murders, and she was manipulated. Gwendolyn doesn't appear to be the more compelling or appealing of the pair, and Catherine was the one who people seemed to believe more readily. Graham was found guilty of 5 counts of murder, leading to sentences of life for each, without possibility of parole. Catherine didn't get off scot-free. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, carrying 40 years imprisonment, and was eligible for parole since 2005, although remained in prison and had a possible release date of July 6, 2021. Catherine has been slated as a skillful manipulator who was not only the mastermind of the murders, but who also managed to bend the prosecutor and the jury to her manipulations. When Gwendolyn left anyway, Catherine plotted revenge, even though that vengeance would also implicate herself. Revenge is a dessert best served cold. Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown. 1984. 8 murders, 7 rapes, 3 kidnappings, and 14 armed robberies committed across 6 states in just 7.5 weeks. Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown met in 1983. Coleman, 28, already had numerous sex crimes and multiple robbery charges under his belt. Brown, on the other hand, at 21, was relatively quiet. Coleman was born in Illinois in November 1955. His mother worked multiple jobs, and he was raised by his grandmother. If Coleman's defense is to be believed, he was a victim himself. His mother left him in a garbage can as an infant, and his grandmother subjected him to physical and sexual abuse. She practiced voodoo and used him to collect ingredients for her potions. She sent him to graveyards to collect dirt and made him catch and kill small animals as part of her ceremonies. One of his doctors described his mind as a damaged container with damaged contents. He dropped out of school and was arrested 6 times for sexual assault between 1973 and 1983. He was acquitted for 2 of the charges, and 2 other charges were dropped. He was about to stand trial for the sexual assault on a 14-year-old when he started on the crime spree with Deborah Brown. Brown also had her issues. She had experienced severe head trauma as a child and had borderline intellectual functioning, which is characterized by heterogeneous cognitive difficulties and usually carries an IQ of between 70 and 85. She was engaged to another man when she met Coleman and had no criminal record. Coleman and Brown's crime spree started in Wisconsin. Coleman befriended a single mother, Juanita Wheat, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and on May 29, 1984, Vernita, her 9-year-old daughter, was reported missing. 3 weeks later, on June 19th, Vernita's body was found just a few blocks from Coleman's grandmother's apartment in Waukegan, Illinois. The little girl had been sexually assaulted, tortured, and strangled with a ligature. Coleman and Brown abducted 2 more girls, Annie Turks, 9 years old, and Tamika Turks, 7 years old. Annie survived horrific sexual assault inflicted upon her by both Coleman and Brown, but her niece Tamika Brown died from her injuries. Tamika's body was found on the same day as Vernita's body was discovered. At around the same time as the Turks girls went missing, Donna Williams was reported missing. Her body was found a month later in a river in Detroit, sexually assaulted and strangled with a ligature. Still in Michigan, Coleman and Brown broke into the home of an elderly couple who they assaulted and robbed. The crime couple took off across the Midwest on to Ohio, where they strangled a woman and her 9-year-old son. Their bodies were hidden in a crawl space in the home and were only discovered when family members became concerned that she had stopped communicating with them and went to her home. Coleman and Brown forcefully entered another home the same day, beating and robbing the couple living there. In Dayton, Ohio, they stayed with a reverend and his wife for a few days. Their hosts were never harmed, and even drove Brown and Coleman to Cincinnati. A week later, Coleman and Brown abducted Toni Story, 15. She disappeared on her way to a class at her junior high school. Her body was found 8 days after her abduction, and crucially, Coleman's fingerprint was left behind. The discovery led to the FBI placing Coleman and Brown on the top 10 most wanted list. A day after abducting Toni Story, Coleman and Brown broke into another home and assaulted Harry and Marlene Walters. They sexually assaulted Marlene, leaving her dead, with her husband surviving but permanently disabled by the brutal beating. Harry managed to contact the police and told them Coleman and Brown came on the pretext of looking at a camper van the couple had for sale. The camper van was stolen and was found in Kentucky days later. Coleman and Brown kidnapped a college professor while they were in Kentucky. They locked him in the trunk of his own car and stole it. They drove the car back to Ohio with the professor still locked in the trunk. He was rescued later. Coleman and Brown murdered again and stole the victim's car to head back to Illinois. The FBI found the couple in Evanston, Illinois, and they were captured on July 20th. By then, the couple had committed murder in 6 states and were being pursued by authorities from each. Coleman ultimately received 4 death sentences across 3 states, a record number at the time, while Brown was sentenced to death in both Indiana and Ohio, though the latter was commuted to life in prison. Coleman was executed by lethal injection in Ohio in April 2002, while Brown serves out her life sentence in Ohio. Carol M. Bundy and Doug Clark, the Sunset Strip killers. I can't take it anymore. I'm supposed to save lives, not take them. Bundy, in her confession to co-workers. Carol M. Bundy and Doug Clark met at a bar in January 1980 and went on to murder 8 people over the summer of 1980. Carol Bundy's childhood was believed to have been traumatic and filled with abuse. Her parents were both alcoholics, and her father started sexually abusing her at the age of 11, just after the death of her mother. He remarried, and Bundy was placed in foster homes until the age of 17, when she married a 56-year-old man, presumably to escape the foster system. None of her 3 marriages lasted long, and she had 2 sons by her abusive 3rd husband. Bundy started an affair with Jack Murray, the manager of the apartments where she lived. She became obsessed with Jack, a part-time country singer, and she once tried to bribe his wife to leave him so she could have him for herself. Jack's wife told him to evict Bundy, but Bundy was persistent. She followed him to nightclubs where he was singing, and it was at the nightclub Little Nashville where she met Doug Clark. Clark described himself as king of the one-night stands, but something resonated with Bundy, and he soon realized she was willing to assist in his dark fantasies. They moved in together almost immediately, and their affair took a twisted turn. Clark, in his early 30s and 5 years younger than Bundy, started to bring prostitutes home for threesomes. When a neighbor's 11-year-old daughter caught Clark's eye, Bundy helped him lure the girl back to their apartment for sexual photographs and erotic games. The photo sessions and games soon became boring, and Clark started sharing his fantasies of killing women during sex. He was alleged to have wanted to have sex as he killed a woman so he could feel her death spasm. In June 1980, Clark persuaded Bundy to purchase 2 automatic pistols for him. He abducted 2 teenage girls, Gina Norano and Cynthia Chandler, on Sunset Strip, killed them, and dumped their corpses near Ventura Freeway. In his confession to Bundy, he described the murders in great detail, including having sex with their corpses. Bundy, whether angry or jealous that he'd gone on with his own adventure without her, called the police anonymously and said she had information about the 2 murders. 2 weeks later, Clark killed 2 prostitutes in separate murders. Karen Jones and Exie Williams were murdered in the same fashion as his first victims, shot in the head and dumped where the bodies could be found. His fantasies took another twisted turn, however, and he took a trophy, Exie's severed head, back to Bundy, where he insisted she give the head a makeover before he indulged necrophilia. 2 days later, they disposed of the head by putting it in a box and leaving it in an alley. Marnette Comer, a runaway, was found murdered 3 days later in San Fernando Valley woods. She was believed to have been killed 3 weeks before the discovery, making her Clark's first victim. Bundy continued to see Jack Murray in the meantime, and at some point she confessed to him about the murders. She quickly came to regret the confession and worried that Murray would go to the police. Bundy took Murray back to her van after his show on August 5th, murdered him, and decapitated him. She left a lot of evidence to the murder in the van, as well as the fact that she was seen leaving the club with Jack on that night. About a week after Jack Murray's murder, Bundy finally broke down and confessed the crimes to her co-workers. They called the police, and Bundy confessed further to all the women she and Clark had murdered over the summer. Clark was charged with 6 murders, and Bundy was charged with 2. Clark acted as his own defense during the trial and tried to blame Bundy for everything, claiming he was the innocent party. Bundy accepted a plea deal and received a sentence of 52 years to life imprisonment. She died in 2003 of heart failure. Clark received a death sentence. Susan and Michael Bear Carson, the San Francisco witch killers, on a mission from God to exterminate anyone they believed to be a witch. Murdered at least 3 people between 1981 and 1983. James Clifford Carson met Susan Barnes in Phoenix in the late 1970s. They were a couple of divorced parents who were both into drugs and mysticism. Susan knew James was the one because she saw it in a vision whilst on mescaline. They married, sold a house in Scottsdale, and went traveling around Europe on the money. They returned once the money ran out, having changed their names to Michael and Susan Bear. Self-described pacifist, vegetarian, Muslim warriors. The visions became wilder until they decided their mission in life was to kill witches. The couple moved into a Haight-Ashbury apartment with 22-year-old actress Karen Barnes. In March 1981, Susan had another vision that Karen was a witch. Michael killed the actress under Susan's instructions when she objected to becoming Michael's polyamorous other wife. Michael hit Karen over the head with a frying pan and stabbed her 13 times. The pair covered Karen's body, graffitied the walls, including using Susan's name, and left the apartment. Friends of Karen tipped off police about the victim's weird roommates and their strange beliefs, but the Bears were long gone. Susan Bear later confessed to Karen's murder. She showed no remorse as she explained Karen was a witch and had to be killed. The Bears laid low in Northern California for a year when they moved to Humboldt County, South California, to work on a marijuana farm. In a clash of personalities, Susan decided fellow worker Clark Stevens was also a witch and needed to be killed. The decision may have come about because of Stevens cussing out Susan, but the outcome was the same as before. Michael Bear shot Clark Stevens in the face and burned his body in the nearby woods. 2 weeks later, Stevens' charred remains and ID were found. The Bears were at the top of the suspect list, but once again they were long gone. In March of 1983, 2 years after the start of their witch hunt crusade, the murder of Karen Barnes, the couple hitchhiked to a nearby town near Bakersfield. They accepted a ride from John Hellyer. At some point during the ride, John's leg touched Susan, and she didn't like it. She quickly decided John was another witch, and a struggle broke out inside the car as they drove along the Los Angeles highway. Forced to pull over, John exited the car on the side of the highway. The fight escalated, and Susan grabbed John Hellyer, holding him as Michael took aim and shot him in full view of passing motorists. The Bears then got back into John Hellyer's car and made their escape. After a high-speed chase with the LAPD, the couple was finally captured after they drove into a ditch. The Bears said they would confess to their crimes, but only via a press conference. On March 10, 1983, the press conference covered many wild and rambling topics, including George Orwell's novel 1984, the possibility of Ronald Reagan being the devil, and why they were killing witches. The pair claimed Allah had instructed Susan to identify witches and that Michael should be the executioner. The press conference went on for 6 hours. Despite their confessions, the pair pleaded not guilty to 3 charges of murder and other crimes. 2 trials found them guilty of all 3 murders, and they were both sentenced to 75 years to life imprisonment, in separate prisons, of course. Investigators believe the couple could be connected to a dozen other murders across the U.S. and in Europe, and they reportedly kept a kill list of celebrity witches, such as President Ronald Reagan and talk show host Johnny Carson. They have never expressed any remorse for their crimes. Henry Lucas and Otis Toole, the Confession Killers. Arson, cannibalism, and confession to more than 600 murders. Both Lucas and Toole shared common ordeals in their childhood. Both were raised by an abusive mother and were forced to wear girls' clothes. Both suffered sexual trauma before the age of 10. And both had committed murder before they even met. Lucas' mother forced him to watch her having sex with customers. He came to despise her for it. When he was around 10 years old, his brother swung a knife at him and cut his eye. His mother ignored the wound and allowed infection to set in, permanently damaging his left eye. By the time he reached puberty, Lucas was torturing animals and sexually abusing his own brother. At the age of 23, in 1960, Lucas stabbed his mother to death and served 10 years for the murder. His statement to the police: "All I remember was slapping her alongside the neck. When I went to pick her up, I realized she was dead. Then I noticed that I had my knife in my hand and she had been cut." Toole's childhood included similar atrocities. He was betrayed by every person he should have been able to rely upon: his mother, A Christian extremist dressed him as a girl. His sister molested him, and his father prostituted him to a neighbor at the age of 5 years old, and again to other friends when he was a teen. When he was just 14, he killed a traveling salesman. The salesman picked up Toole and took him to a local woods in order to have sex, and Toole ran him down with his own car. Lucas had been in and out of jail when he met Toole at a soup kitchen in 1976. They soon realized they shared more than a mutual attraction, quickly realizing they also shared a taste for murder. And they began a sexual relationship that quickly turned far more sinister as they set off across the country pursuing their darker desires. Lucas claimed that they killed more than 100 victims together from 1979 to 1981, often with Toole eating the remains. The victims were selected completely at random. Killing someone is just like walking outdoors. If I wanted a victim, I'd go and get one, he said. During the 1970s, Lucas and Toole traveled across 26 states, committing murder and mayhem. They indiscriminately preyed upon anyone that crossed their path: hitchhikers, sex workers, runaways, and migrants. The pair bonded over their activities as any young couple would. They talked about their activities, comparing notes and swapping tips. Lucas claimed he coached Toole on getting away with murder. He advised his partner to make the crimes more random, less regimented. I started to correct him in his ways, in doing the crime where he wouldn't leave information, Lucas said. It wasn't enough to just murder their victims, however. Often they would rape and torture them before making the kill. After their victims were dead, the couple would mutilate the bodies. Lucas later said they didn't feel remorse for their actions. He joked that he once crossed 2 state lines with someone's severed head in the back seat. The relationship fell apart when Lucas became Toole's teenage niece, Becky Powell, and ran off with her and left Toole. Lucas and Becky didn't make the ideal couple, and soon the adoration wasn't enough. They argued. Lucas lured Becky to a field where he murdered her, dismembered her body, and scattered the remains across the field. Then Lucas lured the woman who owned the ranch out to the same field, killed her, and stuffed her body into a drainage pipe. In 1983, Toole was imprisoned for arson in Florida and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Lucas was arrested 2 months later for possession of a deadly weapon. Lucas began boasting about the murderous rampage he and Toole had committed during their relationship. At first, Toole denied any involvement, but later corroborated Lucas's claims. But the truth is, no one knows how many people Lucas Toole killed. After their arrests, police were eager to hear them confess to countless murders, which helped them close a number of unsolved cases. Toole died in 1996. Lucas continued his confessions, admitting to hundreds of unsolved murders. He was eventually convicted of 11 homicides, including the death of Toole's young niece. He was also convicted of the murder of an unidentified woman dubbed Orange Socks, for which he was sentenced to death. By 1986, he confessed to and therefore helped law enforcement clear 213 unsolved cases. However, That was the year the Texas Attorney General's office started comparing Lucas's claims to verified reports on his whereabouts at the time, and found enough contradictions to make the Attorney General doubt his confessions. Lucas confessed to more than 600 murders. When his confessions were eventually doubted, he made another confession. "I made the police look stupid. I was out to wreck Texas law enforcement," he said. The motivation to lie about the crimes went beyond making law enforcement look stupid. Confessions also carried perks. He'd get a day out to look at the scene of a crime, and he'd often get fast food on the way. For a prisoner, getting a day out broke up the daily monotony of prison life. Having said that, some Texas Rangers were convinced Lucas did commit some of the murders he confessed to and wasn't tried for. He was caught out trying to confess to a murder he definitely didn't commit. But on another occasion, he led the officers right to the deer stand where a murder did take place, and there was no possibility he could have known that detail unless he had been involved in the murder. Henry Lucas and Otis Toole were convicted of only a fraction of the crimes they eventually confessed to. 6 for Toole and 11 for Lucas, and no one can really know how many they actually committed together and separately. District Attorney Ken Anderson, who prosecuted Lucas, said he believed the murderer had killed anywhere from 3 to a dozen people. Charles Starkweather and Carol Fugate. Inspiration for the movie Natural Born Killers. Starkweather could be described as a troubled teen. At school, he was bullied for his stutter, and over time, as his strength grew, so did his pent-up anger. He idolized James Dean, and the actor's portrayal of social outcast resonated with him. He dropped out of school to help his family with household bills, as his father was often unable to work because of crippling arthritis. At his work in a newspaper warehouse, his ex-girlfriend introduced him to her sister, Carol Fugate. He was 18. Carol was just 13. The relationship would have been frowned upon if it had been brought to the attention of law enforcement, as the legal age of consent in Nebraska was 16 years of age. He taught her to drive using his father's car. Unfortunately, when she crashed it, it caused an argument in his family, and he ended up being thrown out of the family home. He took work as a garbage collector and used the rounds to check out homes and plan robberies. In late November 1957, Starkweather tried to get credit at a gas station in order to buy his girlfriend a gift. When the cashier refused the requested credit, Starkweather robbed the gas station at gunpoint, took the cashier out into nearby woods, and shot him dead. Just under 2 months later, Starkweather went to call on his girlfriend. Her stepfather and mother told him in no uncertain terms that he was to stay away from her. Starkweather shot both and then strangled and stabbed their toddler daughter, Carol's stepsister. The couple disposed of the bodies and stayed in the house for a few days after the murders. To give them some time without anyone coming to visit, a note was placed in the window warning visitors to stay away because of the flu. When neighbors finally began to ask questions and become suspicious, Starkweather and Fugate fled the house and went on the run in his car. They went to a friend of the Fugate family, August Mayer's house, shot the old man, and killed his dog. Fugate later claimed that the ferocity with which Starkweather beat the dog to death was the reason she feared for her life and believed going along with Starkweather was the only way she could survive the ordeal. Again, they fled the murder scene, but Starkweather drove off the road and the car became stuck in the mud. Two teenagers, Robert Jensen and Carol King, stopped to help them, and Starkweather shot and killed Robert. He then attempted to rape Carol, and when he failed, he shot and killed her too. Starkweather would go on to accuse Fugate of killing Carol King, which Fugate denies. Their next stop was the home of industrialist C. Lauer Ward. After stabbing his maid, Lillian Fensel, to death, Starkweather killed the family dog. When Ward's wife, Clara, came home, he stabbed her to death too. He finished up by fatally shooting C. Lauer Ward. The couple robbed the house and searched for a new getaway vehicle. The pair found a Buick at the side of the road. The owner of the vehicle, Merle Collison, was asleep inside, and Starkweather shot him. Again, Starkweather would go on to claim Fugate was the one that shot and killed Collison, and again she denied killing anyone. The Buick had a brake mechanism that Starkweather was unfamiliar with, and the car stalled when he tried to drive away. A passing motorist, Joe Sprinkle, stopped to help, and a fight broke out when the motorist saw the body of Collison shoved under the dashboard of the Buick. A Natrona County Sheriff deputy, William Romer, showed up as Starkweather threatened Joe Sprinkle with a gun. Fugate tried to seek the protection of the deputy, and Starkweather leaped into the car and made his getaway again, leaving her behind. Roadblocks were set up ahead, and though he attempted to blow through at 100 miles per hour, an exchange of gunfire made him rethink his strategy. One of the deputy's bullets shattered Starkweather's windscreen, cutting his ear. Starkweather pulled over and surrendered. The deputies were not impressed by the teenager's false bravado. He thought he was bleeding to death, one of the arresting officers said. That's why he stopped. That's the kind of yellow son of a bitch he is. Arrested, Starkweather was brought up on only one charge of first-degree murder, Robert Jensen. Starkweather agreed to be extradited from Wyoming to Nebraska because he believed prosecutors would seek the death penalty there, as the governor of Nebraska was against the death penalty. The governor made an exception specifically for Starkweather. At trial, Starkweather changed his story several times. He said Fugate wasn't there at all. Then he said she was a willing participant. Starkweather was found guilty and sentenced to death. Before his execution, he said Fugate should also be executed. He was executed on June 25, 1959. Throughout her trial, Fugate maintained that she was Starkweather's hostage and that he threatened to kill her family if she didn't follow him. She claimed that she was too terrified to run away while he drove her around on his killing spree. The judge ruled that she had ample opportunity to escape and gave her a life sentence on November 25, 1958. She was the youngest person in American history to be tried for first-degree murder at the time. Fugate was paroled on good behavior after 18 years. Her attempt at a pardon was denied. Billy Joel's song, "We Didn't Start the Fire," references the Stark. Bruce Springsteen's song, "Nebraska," was based on the murders. The murder spree influenced Hollywood too. Terrence Malick's 1973 film Badlands, Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers, and Brad Pitt-Juliette Lewis film California are all based on the Starkweather murders. Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez, both convicted of 3 murders and executed at Sing Sing prison. Raymond Fernandez was born on December 17, 1914 in Hawaii. Fernandez was of Spanish descent, and he moved to Spain where he served in the military during World War II. Fernandez married and had children in Spain. After his military service, Fernandez was in an accident. A steel hatch fell onto the top of his skull. The hospital discharged Fernandez after a lengthy stay, but some who were close to Fernandez reported that his personality changed after the accident. It seemed to have been the start of his career in crime. During a long prison sentence, another inmate introduced Fernandez to voodoo, and it's thought that he believed voodoo rituals made him irresistible to women. Martha Beck was born May 6, 1920, in Milton, Florida. She had a dysfunctional home environment and claimed her brother molested her. Beck's mother beat her when she tried to tell her about the molestation, and as soon as she could, Beck left home and moved to California. She worked odd jobs and put herself through nursing training, earning her nursing degree. She found work as a nurse on a military base and dated several officers. She became pregnant, but when she told the father, he committed suicide. Beck returned to Florida with her child and said the child's father was killed in battle overseas. She was soon dating again and became pregnant. The father married her, but they divorced after 6 months. Beck was obsessed with romance novels and the idea of finding the perfect man. She began responding to Lonely Hearts ads, and through such an ad, she met Fernandez. Beck and Fernandez corresponded for weeks before meeting. Fernandez wrote and asked Beck to send a lock of her hair, which she did. Fernandez didn't want the hair for any romantic reasons. He supposedly used it in a voodoo ritual. Fernandez found his first mark in a Lonely Hearts Club in 1946, an older woman. He dated her until he had gained enough of her trust to loot her bank account. The following year, he took Jane Thompson, the latest in a line of victims, to Spain on a cruise, with his estranged wife tagging along. Somewhere along the line, a little after Jane Thompson changed her will, leaving everything to Fernandez, she died in mysterious circumstances. Fernandez claims Jane died of a heart attack, but her mother believes she died in a train crash. No autopsy was performed to clarify the matter. Fernandez next targeted Beck as his next intended victim. A nurse and single mother surely had money to plunder. He lived in New York and she lived in Florida. They corresponded and he traveled to meet her. However, what Fernandez was not counting on were Beck's 2 children. She hadn't mentioned any children in her letters. He ended their first date early. Beck became distressed and threatened suicide if Fernandez stopped seeing her. Something about her made him rethink his decision, and he continued to see her. Fernandez even confessed about his criminal past and the plot to defraud her. Beck liked the idea so much that she decided to join him. After being fired from her job, Beck moved to New York to join Fernandez. Soon after, Beck abandoned her 2 children at a local Salvation Army. That told Fernandez all he needed to know about her commitment to him. He had found his true soulmate in Beck, and from then on, she became his completely devoted partner in crime. The two sifted through Lonely Hearts ads. Fernandez played the part of a single man looking for the right woman, and Beck posed as his sister. As with many other notorious murder cases, the number of women Beck and Fernandez victimized has never been thoroughly determined. It could be as many as 20 or as few as 4. They traveled around the country as brother and sister. Fernandez dated women through Lonely Hearts ads under Beck's jealously watchful eye. Fernandez married one victim, Myrtle Young, in 1948. Beck refused to leave the couple alone, which must have seemed very weird for the newlywed bride. Beck's rule was that Fernandez couldn't have sex with their intended victims. Myrtle became aggravated with what she probably saw as a meddling sister-in-law who needed to mind her own business. Fernandez gave his new bride some pills to calm her, which led to an accidental overdose. Beck and Fernandez boarded a bus to Myrtle's home state of Arkansas with her still unconscious. Admitted to a hospital upon their arrival, Myrtle died 6 days later. Janet Fay became their next target. Fernandez began dating 66-year-old Janet in January 1949 under his sister Beck's watchful eye. Fernandez broke Beck's rule and went to bed with his new wife. Beck caught them in bed and became enraged. She furiously beat Janet with a ball-peen hammer. Fernandez finished off his new wife by strangling her. The two put Janet's body in a trunk, which they left at Fernandez's real sister's house. Janet's body was eventually buried under cement in the basement. After killing Janet, Beck and Fernandez spent all her savings, and to make it seem as if all was well, sent fake letters to her family. Once they depleted Janet's funds, the couple found their next victim in 41-year-old Delphine Downing. Delphine lived again with her 2-year-old daughter, Renelle. Beck and Fernandez went to stay with Delphine in late February 1949. Delphine became suspicious of Beck and Fernandez after only a few days. When she voiced her concerns and refused to marry Fernandez, and so giving him access to her funds, he gave her a dose of sleeping pills. As Delphine lay unconscious, young Renelle became upset, and Beck choked the child. Renelle survived, but had very noticeable red marks on her neck. They knew once Delphine saw the marks on her daughter's neck, she would call the police. Fernandez shot Delphine in the head, but kept Renelle alive for a few more days before drowning her in the bathtub. Both Delphine and Renelle were buried in the basement. Neighbors reported the suspicious activity at Delphine's home. The next day, the police came to the house for a welfare check. The police discovered the bodies of Delphine and Renelle in the basement. Fernandez initially confessed to 17 murders, but quickly recanted. Fernandez felt safe confessing to murder in Michigan, where there was no death penalty. What Fernandez didn't realize was that the police could tie him and Beck to the murder of Janet Faye in New York, where the two would face the death sentence. The couple was extradited to New York to face charges for the murder of Janet Faye. The case of the Lonely Hearts Killers received a lot of publicity. Both took the stand to try to save their own lives, claiming insanity, but the jury wasn't convinced. Fernandez's last words: "I want to shout it out. I love Martha. What do the public know about love?" Beck's last words: "My story is a love story, but only those tortured by love can know what I mean. I am not unfeeling, stupid, or moronic. I am a woman who had a great love and always will have it. Imprisonment in the death house has only strengthened my feeling for Raymond." Both were executed in the electric chair on May 8, 1951. Ray and Faye Copeland, oldest serial killers on death row. "You'll find nothing on my place," Ray told detectives. Ray and Faye Copeland were convicted of killing 5 drifters. Although no other bodies were discovered, it's likely that they killed at least 7 more. At the ages of 76, Ray, and 69, Faye, they became the oldest couple ever sentenced to death in the United States at the time of sentencing. Faye was the oldest woman on death row until her sentence was commuted to life in prison in 1999. Ray Copeland had a long criminal record, ranging from petty theft to grand larceny, and a few things in between. He had a number of convictions and was notorious for writing bad checks. Born in Oklahoma in 1914, Ray Copeland had a hard childhood. He dropped out of school early to help the family finances and left school an illiterate boy with no prospects. During the Depression, when work was hard to come by, he started stealing. He stole a couple of hogs, and his father covered for him. He then started forging government checks in Harrison, Arkansas. He spent a year in county jail when he was caught. Marriage and children did not stop his criminal career. He continued to be arrested for stealing livestock or writing dud checks. He dragged his wife and young family from one town to the next, trying to keep one step ahead of the law. Despite the violence and abuse Ray inflicted upon his wife and children, she was brought up in a deeply religious family and believed divorce was a moral sin, and so she bowed my neck and took it. Ray was accused of stealing horses from a farmer neighbor, and though no charges were brought, he decided it was once again time to move on. They made their way back to Arkansas and hadn't been there a month before he was arrested for stealing cattle and served a year in the state penitentiary. Straight out of the penitentiary, he was arrested again for cattle theft, and once again they moved on. That formed a pattern for a while, getting arrested for theft or forgery, moving on, getting arrested again. Finally, in 1967, Ray and Faye and their children settled on a 40-acre farm in Mooresville, Arkansas. Faye supported the family in motel jobs while her husband worked the farm, buying and selling livestock, forging checks, and generally scheming. Copeland began picking up hitchhikers to work on his farm sometime in the 1970s. His neighbors worried about the transient young men Ray brought into their neighborhood. Ray saw them as cheap labor and yet another scam. The drifters went to auction, bought stock with forged checks, and moved on before the check bounced. It all worked well until one of the drifters was caught and confessed to the scheme. Ray Copeland was once again arrested and sent to jail for forgery. When he got out of jail, Ray had already decided to work smarter on his next scheme. He offered $50 a week plus room and board to help out on the farm. He placed the ad in missions and shelters and accepted homeless men with open arms. Ray gave each new employee $200 to open a checking account at a bank, using a P.O. box as their address. When the check came through, they went to auctions to buy cattle that the man would pay for with his brand new checkbook. The cattle went to Ray's farm. The drifter drifted on, and the check bounced. One of the drifters, Dennis Murphy, was wanted for writing bad checks at cattle auctions. Police investigations found that the cattle had been taken from the auction in Ray Copeland's trailer, so the police went to ask Ray some questions. Ray claimed that Murphy had also written bad checks to him and said that one day he just up and left. The sheriff believed the story. Another drifter, Wayne Warner, brought a deputy from a different county, and the Copelands gave the same story. 7 men, all transient, all wanted for similar crimes, and they all had one common connection: Ray Copeland. In 1989, Jack McCormick called Missouri authorities and told them he'd seen human bones on Copeland's farm. The authorities used cadaver dogs to search the farm but turned up nothing. Under further questioning, McCormick recanted his statement about finding bones. But he told them about another scam Ray had drafted him into. McCormick said he was very afraid of Ray. He told police that he'd gone with Ray to shoot raccoon at a neighbor's farm, but he'd kept his eye on Ray. When Ray told him to poke about under the barn to scare the raccoon out, he turned to find Ray's .22 bolt-action Marlin rifle pointed at his head. McCormick talked his way out of the situation by promising to leave town and never come back. He told Ray he wanted to make good on the dud check he'd written and convinced Ray to take him to the bank so he could deposit his earnings to cover it. Ray took him into town, and McCormick slipped out of the back of the bank over to a used car lot where he took a car out on a test drive. McCormick tested that car all the way to Nebraska before making a call to the police. The police started linking the evidence together. 7 missing men, all wanted for check fraud at cattle auctions, all having some connection to the Copelands. Police got a tip that Ray often worked on neighboring farms, and one of the barns on one of the farms smelled bad. Dead animal bad. Police searched that property and found a shallow grave containing the remains of 3 men, all killed by a .22 bullet to the head. In another barn on the same property, he found another body, and in a well on another property, they discovered a body wearing a belt with the name Dennis on it. A search of the Copelands' farm uncovered many of the missing men's belongings, including a trophy quilt made of the men's clothing. The murder weapon, a .22 gauge bolt-action Marlin rifle, was taken into evidence. They also found a list of men's names hidden in a camera case. Some of the names had an X next to it. Most of the names were flagged in connection with the dud check scam. Identifying the bodies proved an almost impossible task. Drifters without medical or dental records are not easy to trace. Dennis Murphy was identified by the odd shape of jawbone. Forensic scientists were able to identify other bodies, and they all appeared on the list of names, and all had an X at the side. Ray and Faye Copeland were tried for 5 murders. Faye went to trial first and was convicted on all 5 counts. At Ray's trial, he was found guilty of the same and given the same sentence, sentenced to death by lethal injection. There is some doubt as to Faye Copeland's guilt. The only evidence found that she had anything to do with the murders was the list of names in her handwriting and the trophy quilt made of the clothing from the men. Her son claims she was a battered wife, victim of years of abuse. Faye said that whatever her husband said, she would comply without question for fear of being beaten. She refused a plea deal because she had no information to bargain with. She had no knowledge of the murders, and so had no knowledge of where any of the bodies were hidden. Though both were sentenced to death, neither died at the hands of an executioner. Ray died in prison hospital, and Faye suffered a stroke and was released on compassionate grounds to live out her days in a rest home. She died a year later.